What happens when your own daughter mocks the man you love, only to discover he's the one who can hold the family together? Linda never expected her new husband to become their greatest hope. What followed left everyone in awe. For as long as she could remember, Linda had devoted her entire life to her family. After her husband's sudden passing 8 years ago, her days revolved around her daughter Karen and granddaughter Sophie. Linda's world was school pickups, Sunday dinners, and the small rituals of togetherness that had carried them through years of sorrow and recovery. Karen, headstrong and practical, relied on her mother's steady presence, but never hesitated to critique, manage, or, at times, simply dismiss her mother's attempts at happiness. When Linda met Edward, it felt like a door opening after years of living in a single, dimly lit room. He was gentle, bookish, a retired engineer with an odd sense of humor and a passion for classical music. Their paths crossed at the library's poetry night, and what began as shy conversation soon blossomed into shared lunches, long walks by the river, and the kind of quiet understanding Linda had almost forgotten was possible. Karen did not approve. From the very beginning, she scoffed at the idea of her mother dating again. "Mom, you're nearly 70. What do you even talk about?" And rolled her eyes whenever Edward's name was mentioned. At first, Linda tried to explain, hoping Karen would see what she saw: Edward's warmth, his quirky jokes, his sincere affection. But Karen only grew more critical, calling Edward boring, old-fashioned, and, on more than one occasion, an embarrassment. The tension grew with every family gathering. At Sophie's birthday, Karen made a point of ignoring Edward, answering his attempts at conversation with curt replies or outright sarcasm. Linda's heart ached as she watched Edward's face flush, his jokes fall flat in the chilly air of her daughter's disapproval. Linda tried to smooth things over, focusing on the party, but the air was thick with unsaid words. Outside the family circle, life with Edward flourished. Linda found herself invited to book clubs, recitals, even a community garden project. Edward encouraged her to paint again, a hobby she had abandoned when her first husband fell ill. For the first time in years, Linda painted with abandon, filling the apartment with canvases bursting with color. Edward hung her work in every room, inviting friends over to admire her latest masterpiece. Yet every joy was tinged with Karen's scorn. She called less, came by only when she needed something: help with Sophie's math homework, a ride to the mechanic, money to cover an unexpected bill. When Linda asked if she'd like to join her and Edward for dinner or an art show, Karen always declined, making a snide remark about Mom's midlife crisis. Sophie, now 15 and increasingly caught between loyalty to her mother and affection for her grandmother, watched the tension grow but said little. Things came to a head one Saturday evening in late spring. Linda invited Karen and Sophie for dinner, hoping to bridge the gap. Edward spent the afternoon preparing his famous lasagna, setting the table with Linda's favorite china and playing Vivaldi in the background. Karen arrived late, already irritable from a hectic workweek. She barely greeted Edward and Linda before launching into a rant about her boss, her bills, and the world's general unfairness. As the meal began, Karen's sarcasm sharpened. She mocked Edward's old man tastes in music, poked fun at his gentle stammer, and laughed openly when he shared a story from his days as an engineer. Linda's hands shook as she passed the bread, her appetite gone. Edward, ever patient, smiled and excused himself to fetch dessert. When he was out of earshot, Karen turned to her mother. "Mom, are you really serious about this? He's not like Dad. He's just weird. Doesn't it bother you how people must see you?" Linda, fighting back tears, answered quietly, "I love him, Karen. He makes me happy. Isn't that enough?" Karen scoffed, shaking her head. "Whatever. I just hope you know what you're doing." After dinner, Edward offered Karen a ride home, which she refused. Sophie lingered, hugging her grandmother tightly before following her mother out the door. The silence left in their wake felt heavier than ever. That night, as Linda cleaned up alone, Edward returned to the kitchen, his face gentle but somber. "I'm sorry, Linda. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Linda shook her head, holding his hand. "You haven't. I just wish Karen would give you a chance." Edward squeezed her hand, promising quietly, "I'll always try for you." And so, as spring slid toward summer, Linda found herself at a crossroads, torn between her daughter's expectations and her own right to happiness. The days ahead would test them all in ways none of them could foresee. Linda awoke the next morning with a heavy ache in her chest. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, torn between calling Karen to smooth things over and letting her daughter cool off. Edward, already up, was quietly tending to his tomatoes on the balcony. He noticed Linda's troubled expression and set aside his gardening gloves, joining her at the table with 2 steaming mugs of tea. "Did I make things worse last night?" Edward asked, voice gentle. Linda shook her head, managing a weak smile. "It's not your fault. Karen's always been protective, but lately it feels like she's looking for reasons to push us away." Edward nodded, understanding. "Give her time. Sometimes hearts need space to grow." His words, simple and calm, brought Linda a measure of comfort. She resolved not to let Karen's criticism steal her happiness. Instead, she spent the weekend lost in her painting, Edward at her side, classical music drifting through the apartment as sunlight danced on her easel. But Karen's anger did not fade. Days passed without a call or text, and when Linda reached out, she received only short, formal replies. Sophie was the exception. She messaged her grandmother late at night, confiding her own struggles at school and frustration with her mother's moods. Linda listened, always careful not to criticize Karen, gently reassuring Sophie that she was loved. Linda's friends noticed the change in her. At book club, she shared her worries, and her friends, many of them widowed or divorced, offered support. "Let Karen stew for a bit," said Helen, the club's unofficial leader. "Sometimes daughters need to grow up twice, once for themselves and once for their mothers." Linda laughed at the wisdom in that, and for the first time since the disastrous dinner, she felt a little less alone. One afternoon, Edward surprised Linda with tickets to the community orchestra. She hesitated. Karen always mocked her old lady hobbies, but Edward insisted, and they went. The evening was magical. Linda's spirits lifted as music swelled, and she found herself laughing more than she had in weeks. On the way home, they stopped for ice cream, savoring the summer air and the rare freedom of being seen for who they truly were. Meanwhile, Karen's life seemed to spiral. Her job became more stressful, her temper shorter. She argued with Sophie over everything from grades to curfews, and the house felt colder, emptier. One day, Karen's car broke down on the way to work, stranding her at a gas station. With no one else to call, she reluctantly dialed Linda. Edward answered, listening patiently as Karen vented her frustration. He offered to drive out and help, arriving within half an hour, toolbox in hand. Karen greeted him with skepticism, arms folded, but Edward worked quickly and efficiently. Within minutes, he had the car running again. "You should get your battery checked soon," he advised. Karen muttered a terse thanks, already reaching for her keys. Later that night, Linda received a message from Edward, "Karen's safe." Her car was just stubborn, like its owner. Linda laughed despite herself, but her relief quickly faded when she called Karen to check in. "I'm fine, Mom," Karen snapped. "You don't need to send Edward every time something goes wrong." Linda bit back a retort, instead telling her daughter, "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." In the weeks that followed, Linda and Edward grew closer. They planned a small weekend getaway, a drive to a lakeside town where they explored art galleries, tried new foods, and walked hand in hand by the water. Linda felt years younger, her worries about Karen replaced, if only briefly, by joy and gratitude for her new love. Back home, Karen brooded. She resented the fact that her mother's life no longer revolved around her. Yet as her own problems mounted, Sophie's grades slipping, unpaid bills, mounting work stress, she found herself missing Linda's steady guidance and Edward's quiet competence. When Sophie asked to spend the night at her grandmother's, Karen relented. Sophie and Linda spent the evening painting, baking, and talking late into the night. Before bed, Sophie whispered, "I wish Mom would let you be happy." "Edward's nice, Grandma. He makes you smile." Linda hugged her granddaughter close, grateful for the small spark of understanding. As summer rolled on, Linda realized that happiness did not have to come at the expense of love for her family. She could hold space for both, a new life with Edward, and hope for healing with Karen and Sophie. The heat of summer pressed down on the city, making tempers run short and patience thinner still. Linda spent her days painting in the cool of Edward's living room, the walls brightened with her newest canvases, while Edward tended his balcony garden and read her favorite poems aloud. Their life together settled into a gentle rhythm, filled with laughter, art, and music. One Saturday, Edward invited Linda to a barbecue hosted by his neighbors. Linda hesitated, She worried about what people would think, if she would be judged as the old woman who moved on too soon, but Edward reassured her, squeezing her hand. "You belong here, Linda. You belong anywhere you feel loved." The barbecue turned out to be a delight. Edward's friends welcomed Linda warmly, complimenting her paintings and drawing her into conversation about everything from books to city politics. Linda felt at ease, more herself than she had been in years. By the time dessert was served, she was swapping stories and laughing until her sides ached. Meanwhile, Karen's struggles continued to mount. Her work deadlines became crushing, and she snapped at Sophie for the smallest infractions. One afternoon, when Sophie admitted she was failing math, Karen lost her temper, blaming both Sophie and, in a roundabout way, Linda. "If your grandmother would just stop distracting you with her painting and baking, maybe you'd do better in school." Sophie ran to her room in tears. That night, Sophie texted Linda, "Can I come over? I don't want to fight with Mom anymore." Linda welcomed her, and Edward baked his famous shortbread cookies for their arrival. Together, they talked through Sophie's struggles, making a plan to help her catch up in math. Linda promised to tutor Sophie twice a week, and Edward joined in, offering simple engineering tricks to make math less scary. Word of Linda's vibrant new life began to spread. She displayed her art in a local cafe at Edward's urging, and the exhibit was a hit. Old friends and strangers alike stopped by to admire her work, some even asking for commissions. For Linda, it was a revelation. She was more than just a mother or grandmother. She was an artist, a partner, and a friend. Karen heard about the art show from a coworker and was quietly stung by the praise for her mother. Pride and resentment warred inside her. She missed Linda's help at home, but still bristled at the mention of Edward. When she visited the cafe, she stood at the back, watching Linda laughing with friends and customers, and for a moment saw a side of her mother she'd never truly noticed. That evening, Linda called Karen to invite her for Sunday dinner. After some hesitation, Karen agreed. She arrived guarded, eyes darting between her mother and Edward. The meal was lively. Sophie chatted excitedly about her new math plan, Linda served her latest pasta creation, and Edward told a story that had everyone at the table laughing, even Karen, despite herself. After dinner, Karen lingered in the kitchen while Linda washed dishes. There was an awkward silence before Karen finally spoke. "You seem different, Mom. Happier." Linda paused, then answered honestly, "I am. Edward's been good for me. And for Sophie, too." Karen didn't reply, but when she left, she hugged her mother just a little tighter than usual. As August faded, Linda's world grew larger. Her art, her friendships, and her bond with Edward all blossomed. And though Karen's acceptance was slow in coming, the cracks in her resentment began to show. Linda held on to hope, knowing that real change, like real love, could not be rushed. September's arrival brought a sense of new beginnings. Sophie, emboldened by her grandmother's support, returned to school determined to turn her grades around. Linda and Edward became her secret cheerleaders, tutoring her on algebra and cheering every small victory. Edward devised clever games with playing cards to teach math, and Linda rewarded each step with home-baked treats. Sophie's confidence bloomed, and for the first time in months, she looked forward to school. Meanwhile, Linda's art continued to draw attention. The local cafe extended her exhibit, and a feature in the community newsletter led to several invitations to speak at the library and teach a painting workshop. Edward took pride in her success, often sitting at the back of her classes, quietly sketching or offering to clean brushes. His unwavering support made Linda feel cherished in a way she'd rarely known before. Karen's world, by contrast, grew more chaotic. Her work schedule became even more punishing, and she was called into HR after snapping at a colleague. At home, she felt the gap widening between her and Sophie, who now spent more and more weekends at Linda and Edward's apartment. The resentment she held toward Edward began to mingle with guilt and loneliness. One evening, Karen arrived at Linda's door unexpectedly, her face drawn and tired. "Sophie's been talking about nothing but math and painting and how much fun she's having. I just wanted to see for myself." Linda welcomed her in, offering tea and a seat at the kitchen table. Edward emerged from his study, offered Karen a gentle hello, then quietly excused himself to leave them alone. The conversation that followed was halting but honest. Karen admitted, for the first time, how hard it had been to lose her father and how threatened she'd felt seeing Linda move on. "It felt like you were leaving us behind, Mom," Karen said softly. Linda reached across the table, her voice steady. "You and Sophie will always be my family. Loving Edward doesn't change that." Tears sprang to Karen's eyes. "I'm just scared, Mom. Everything's changing, and I don't know how to keep up." Linda took her daughter's hand, squeezing gently. "Change is hard, but it can make room for good things too." The days that followed marked a thaw in Karen's resistance. She started coming by for Sunday dinners, sometimes bringing a casserole or flowers. Edward, always courteous, let Karen set the pace, never forcing conversation but always including her with small gestures, a cup of coffee placed by her seat, a gentle joke to lighten the mood. Sophie thrived in the renewed warmth. Her grades climbed, and her joy became contagious. She often invited friends over, eager to show them Linda's paintings and Edward's miniature train set, a collection he proudly displayed in the living room. For the first time, Linda saw her family not just surviving, but growing stronger together. At the next painting workshop, Karen showed up unexpectedly and sat at the back. She watched as Linda guided the class, patient and encouraging. When the session ended, Karen stayed behind, quietly admiring her mother's latest work. "It's beautiful, Mom. You're really talented." Linda smiled, her heart full. The following weekend, Edward invited the whole family to a harvest picnic in the park. They spent the afternoon sharing stories, tossing a frisbee, and sampling apple pie. As the sun set, Karen found herself laughing at Edward's dry humor, even playfully challenging him to a game of chess. For the first time, the sharp edges of her skepticism softened, replaced by cautious respect. That evening, as Linda and Edward tidied up, Linda felt a profound sense of gratitude. The path hadn't been easy. There were scars and wounds that wouldn't heal overnight, but for the first time since her first husband's passing, Linda sensed hope radiating through her family once again. Autumn painted the city in gold and crimson, and Linda's world felt transformed by a warmth that reached far beyond Edward's gentle presence. Sophie's improvement in school was cause for celebration. Her latest report card brought a rare smile to Karen's face and a proud hug from Linda. To mark the occasion, Edward organized a small dinner party, inviting Sophie's favorite teacher and a few family friends. The apartment buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the clink of dishes as everyone toasted Sophie's achievement. Karen, still wary but less guarded, stayed late after dinner. She helped Linda clear the table, chatting more freely than she had in months. When Edward joined them, Karen found herself asking about his days as an engineer, genuinely interested for the first time. Edward told stories of building bridges and working abroad, and Karen listened, surprised by the quiet strength behind his unassuming demeanor. As the days grew shorter, Linda's art workshops expanded. Karen attended one herself, sketching beside her mother and discovering a forgotten pleasure in creativity. The two women laughed together, sharing old memories and new discoveries. Edward supported them both, offering encouragement and lending his engineer's precision to the most ambitious projects. With each passing week, Karen's attitude shifted. She began to see Edward not as a threat, but as a partner in Linda's happiness. When Linda caught a cold, Edward was the first to arrive with soup and medicine. When Sophie needed advice about a science project, Edward spent an afternoon helping her build a model bridge, patient and enthusiastic as ever. Meanwhile, Linda's circle of friends widened. The success of her art shows led to invitations to local galleries and charity events. Edward always attended proudly, introducing Linda as his wife, not just his partner. Linda, for her part, embraced the new attention, feeling for the first time in years that her life was both admired and meaningful outside the family. One evening in late October, Karen called Linda in a panic. Sophie had fallen during basketball practice and needed stitches. Linda and Edward rushed to the hospital, arriving before Karen. Edward calmed Sophie while Linda handled paperwork, their teamwork smooth and instinctive. When Karen arrived, she was overwhelmed with relief to find her daughter smiling and her family by her side. After Sophie was patched up and they returned home, Karen sat at the kitchen table, her eyes brimming with gratitude and something else, humility. "I don't know what I'd do without you both," she admitted, her voice cracking. Linda hugged her tightly. "We're family, Karen. That's what we do." Edward simply smiled, his hand resting reassuringly on Linda's shoulder. As Thanksgiving approached, Karen suggested hosting the holiday dinner together, her home and Linda's combined, Edward included at the head of the table. The meal was a patchwork of traditions, laughter, and second helpings, the rooms filled with warmth and belonging. That night, as Linda and Edward walked home beneath falling leaves, Linda squeezed his hand, whispering her thanks. For the first time since they'd married, she felt her world not just healed, but expanded. Love, she realized, was not a finite thing, but a force that grew stronger each time it was shared. With winter's first chill came a season of celebration and reflection. Linda's apartment was filled with the fragrance of cinnamon and pine as she and Edward prepared for their first holiday season as a blended family. Edward strung lights on the balcony and baked his famous gingerbread, while Linda crafted handmade ornaments with Sophie and her friends, the kitchen bursting with creativity and laughter. Karen was a frequent visitor now, drawn by both Sophie's joy and her mother's calm presence. She began to rely on Edward in ways she never imagined, asking for advice about her car, letting him help fix a leaky faucet, and occasionally calling him Ed with a smile. The sharpness in her tone was gone, replaced by something softer, respect, and even affection. The family's bond was tested one snowy Saturday when a burst pipe flooded Karen's basement. Panic-stricken, she called Linda, who immediately alerted Edward. Without hesitation, Edward gathered his tools and bundled up for the storm. Together, he and Linda drove to Karen's house, where Edward took charge, turning off the water, organizing cleanup, and calling a friend who specialized in repairs. Linda kept Sophie and her little cousins entertained with hot cocoa and stories, turning the chaos into an unexpected adventure. By evening, the house was drying out, the children were laughing, and Karen was overwhelmed with gratitude. She sat with Linda and Edward by the fire, exhaustion in her eyes but relief in her voice. "I never thought I'd say this, but I don't know what we'd do without you, Edward." Edward chuckled, brushing off the praise. "We're family. That's what matters." Linda watched the exchange, heart full. The transformation in her family had been slow, hard one, but moments like this made every trial worthwhile. As the holidays approached, Sophie urged the family to host a neighborhood cookie exchange. Edward organized a carol sing-along, and Linda taught her signature recipes to a houseful of neighbors and friends. Karen joined in, surprising everyone with her surprisingly good fudge. Laughter spilled from every room. The house, once divided by suspicion, was united in celebration. The community noticed the change, too. Linda's art was featured in the city's winter festival, with Edward helping to set up the display and Sophie acting as her grandmother's art ambassador. At the opening, Karen mingled easily, chatting about Edward's garden and Sophie's newfound love of painting. For Linda, it was a moment of pure joy to see her family, once fractured, now whole and shining. Christmas Eve was spent together in Linda and Edward's apartment, stockings hung, presents exchanged, and old family movies watched late into the night. Karen, drowsy with contentment, hugged Edward before she left, a simple gesture that said everything words could not. Later, as snow fell gently outside, Linda and Edward sat side by side, the glow of the tree illuminating their faces. "You saved us, you know," Linda whispered. Edward shook his head. "We saved each other." And as midnight came and went, Linda felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The love she'd fought for, imperfect, hard-won, and resilient, had not only healed her heart, but had finally brought her family together. The new year brought fresh snow and a sense of hopeful renewal. Linda's apartment was still aglow with holiday warmth, and Edward's laughter had become as familiar as the tick of the kitchen clock. Sophie spent weekends painting with Linda, her canvases reflecting newfound confidence, while Edward gave her advice on everything from study skills to fixing her bike. The line between grandmother, mother, and friend blurred, replaced by the solid unity of family. Karen, once distant, found herself turning to Edward for help more often. When her car stalled during a storm, it was Edward who braved the icy roads to jumpstart it. At Sophie's school science fair, Edward proudly explained Sophie's bridge model to the judges, then shared an embarrassed but delighted grin when she won second prize. Karen saw for the first time how much Edward had given, not just to Linda, but to all of them. Linda's art continued to flourish. She hosted a charity auction for the animal shelter, with Edward and Karen at her side helping to hang canvases and greet guests. The event raised more money than expected, and local papers wrote glowingly about Linda's remarkable family spirit. Karen, reading the article, realized with a twinge of guilt how harshly she'd judged Edward at first. Spring brought change in other ways, too. Linda was asked to teach a 6-week painting course at the community college, and Edward volunteered to drive her each week, always waiting in the campus cafe with a book and a smile. Karen began inviting Linda and Edward over for Sunday brunches, her home filled with the same laughter and warmth that had once seemed lost. At one brunch, as everyone lingered over coffee and pastries, Karen raised her glass for a quiet toast. To family, however it's made, and to those who show up when it matters most. Her gaze met Edward's, her voice soft with sincerity. "Thank you for everything, Ed." Edward, surprised and touched, simply nodded. Linda squeezed his hand beneath the table, her eyes bright with gratitude. Sophie thrived in the new harmony, bringing friends home to meet Grandma and Grandpa Ed, as she'd started to call him. Together, the family attended Sophie's first art show, where she beamed with pride at her painting hung alongside Linda's. The experience was a milestone, a symbol of just how much love, perseverance, and forgiveness could transform lives. One quiet evening, Linda and Edward sat on the balcony, city lights twinkling below. Linda rested her head on his shoulder. "I can't believe how far we've come," she whispered. Edward kissed her forehead, his voice steady. "You and Karen built this family. I was just lucky enough to help." As the stars shimmered overhead, Linda understood that every trial had been worth it. The family she loved was stronger for all they'd endured, united not just by blood, but by kindness, acceptance, and the willingness to begin again. As spring ripened into early summer, Linda's world sparkled with possibility. Her family, once fragile and divided, now came together with a rhythm as natural as the changing seasons. She looked forward to each day, painting in the morning light, planning community events with Edward, and welcoming Sophie's friends for afternoon art sessions. Karen had found her own renewal. With work steadier and her relationship with Linda restored, she reached out more often, not with demands, but with invitations. She and Linda cooked together, swapping old recipes and creating new ones. Karen began to see Edward not as a replacement, but as a gift, someone who loved her mother, respected their family's past, and brought something uniquely his own. One weekend in June, Linda and Edward celebrated their wedding anniversary with a backyard barbecue. Family and friends gathered beneath strings of fairy lights, sharing stories and laughter. Karen, apron on and tongs in hand, flipped burgers with Sophie while Edward gave a short, heartfelt toast. "Family is built, not given," he said quietly. "Thank you for letting me be part of yours." Sophie, full of teenage pride and affection, presented Linda with a framed painting she'd created, a portrait of Linda, surrounded by bright flowers, with Edward and Karen at her side. "For the woman who holds us all together," Sophie declared, and Linda, eyes wet with tears, hugged her granddaughter close. As the sun set and the garden filled with fireflies, Linda slipped away to the kitchen for a quiet moment alone. She gazed at the family she'd fought for, the life she'd rebuilt with Edward's unwavering support. The wounds of the past had healed, not erased, but transformed into the scars of wisdom and love. Later that night, as Linda and Edward walked the garden path hand in hand, Linda felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The future, once so uncertain, now shimmered with hope. Whatever challenges might come, she knew this family would face them together. In her journal, Linda wrote, "My daughter mocked the man I love. But through patience and kindness, he became the heart of our family. Together, we found something stronger than judgment. We found belonging." As the first stars appeared overhead, Linda whispered a quiet thank you to the world, for second chances, for unexpected blessings, and for a family saved by love.